began with the Industrial Revolution and is continuing. It is continuing not only in terms of technology, but in terms of time and age. Historically, cultures have recorded time and age in terms of rulers. Historians speak of the age of Constantine, the age of Napoleon. The Book of Kings describes time in terms of who was ruling. And almost all European history is written in terms of ruling families: the Stuarts, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons. The history of the papacy is largely a history of the noble families of Rome. This is no longer true. Time, which is once identified with eternity, something remote, mysterious, covering a vast expanse and periods of great significance, has become something immediate, something precise. It has moved from the abstract to the specific. Real time now refers to virtually simultaneous activity of a giant computer. Solar time to the movements of the sun. Production time to work schedules. Age has been similarly reduced and categorized. We don't refer to the modern period as being the age of Hitler or the age of Reagan. Such periods are referred to by their attitudes, such as the Cold War, or the Nazi period, or the supply-side economic period. Age today means the chronological record of an individual's life, overall or to date. Age is a personal attribute which we attach to the individual as one of several means of measurement. Like our concept of time, it has become specific, restrictive, and definite. This new stress resulted in fixed hours of work for perhaps the first time in history, culminating in the time card at factories and offices. Sometime in the 1870s, the phrases of on time and behind time and ahead of time became part of everyone's language and everyone's life. Punctuality became a measure of character. Persistent tardiness, even in minutes, could lead to the loss of a job or the disruption of a schedule. Large-scale production of public and private clocks didn't begin until the late 1830s, and mass-produced pocket watches didn't begin until the late 1860s. In late 1882, American railroad companies ignored the government and set up uniform time zones in the nation. And in 1884, representatives from 25 nations met in Washington, D.C., and settled on Greenwich, England as the zero meridian, fixed the exact length of the day for the first time in history, and divided the globe, again for the first time, into 24 time zones. We have been carrying Father Time around on our shoulders ever since. It is as though time and age, a measure of our persons, have changed from the objective and distant concepts into something of everyday elements of our lives. Now, this has placed us an immeasurable distance from the time of earlier periods, and it has much to do with the existing alienation of psychology, education, sociology, law, science, and the humanities from Western and Christian tradition. Age, for instance, was not even included in the 1850 census. Individual age was not considered that important Prior to the mid-19th century and later, birthdays were not mentioned and not celebrated. Nobody went to school at a certain fixed age, nor were classes segregated by age. People of all ages mingled at social gatherings. Children were regarded as miniature adults. Students had traditionally moved forward in their studies according to their levels of proficiency. It was not uncommon for some to graduate from Harvard at 17, while others didn't even enter until they were in their 20s. The one-room schoolhouse, which lingered a long time in rural areas, was the arena of a mixed group, ranging from small children to persons in their teens or even early 20s. But Horace Mann, devotee of Prussian school methods, helped change all that. School grades and ages became standardized in the larger urban centers in the 1840s and gradually spread across the country. The new system effectively destroyed precocity and fashioned a single pace upon all students of the same age, irrespective of ability. Progress became measured in time. Maturity became identified with graduation from school. And this gradually lengthened into the graduate schools of today, where students don't emerge until they are anywhere from 22 to 35 years old, depending upon their specialties. Now, all this was a radical departure from preceding centuries when people were judged as mature at the age of 12 in both the Christian and Judaic traditions. The emphasis placed by educators upon chronological age was part of an entire societal trend joined later by the medical profession, in which illnesses associated with infancy or old age became a subspecialty. And as usual, the courts joined the professional trend. Rulings began to be made regarding child custody on the basis of the age of the children, instead of upon precedents based upon the rights of fathers. Higher limits were made on the age of consent and the right to marry, which had traditionally been 12 years. The new legal substructure led to juvenile courts, which removed criminal behavior by children out of the regular courts and made young lawbreakers wards of the state and segregated the treatment of juveniles in the land. A legal child today is anyone who is one day short of 18 years. Simultaneously, the new profession of psychology undertook efforts in both Europe and the United States to measure intelligence. The IQ test, based on a wide variety of experiments, became an accepted standard and was hailed as part of the new breakthrough of science, a term that in the 19th century acquired the awe that was once associated with religion. Even intelligence tests were linked to chronological age. Children were expected to achieve a certain score at each year until they were 16, or they would be judged behind or ahead of their peer group. This was part of an assumption that there are normal rates of growth against which each child would be measured, despite the wealth of information that indicates a wide variety of disparity between the rates of maturation. And even more interesting is the fact that no studies, so far as I know, have ever been made to indicate how the use of intelligence in later life matches against the IQ scores achieved in childhood. After all, life itself is supposed to be the great test by which we are all judged. But psychology is not so much interested in matching its assumptions against that great scoreboard, nor, for that matter, do the intelligence ratings of psychologists themselves ever seem to have been published. It was pointed out by some that placing all children in the same school grades on the basis of chronological age conflicted with varying rates of intelligence and varying rates of growth. But leading educators such as John Dewey, insisted upon talking about the sixes and the eights and so forth, quote, each of which was held to have its own developmental requisites in which the teacher was required to fit the curriculum in order to cultivate responsible and productive citizens, end quote. Many of the methods that John Dewey introduced at his experimental school at the University of Chicago came from his teacher at Johns Hopkins University, a professor named G. Stanley Hall. Dr. Hall issued in 1904 a very important book. It was titled Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relation to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education. John Lofton, where are you when we need you? It expounded theories that Hall taught to Dewey, Arnold Gesell, and Louis Terman, all who became later famous for their work with children. Quote, using Dewey's work, Darwin's work in biology, and Spencer's social application of the Darwinian, Hall had developed a psychological theory positing that the growing human organization recapitulated the stages of evolution experienced by the human race from pre-savagery to civilization, end quote. Now this was a rather elaborate, ahistoric, Victorian fantasy. The first 18 years were broken into three stages. Infancy and early childhood was compared to pre-savage periods of history during which parents and teachers were told to leave the children to nature, encourage play with blocks and sand to foster muscle development. At 6 or 7, the child experienced crises that led to pre-adolescent years of 6 to 12 or 8 to 12, whose behavior was compared by Hall to that of the early pygmies and other savages. The child was now ready to enter school and to be drilled and disciplined. A new period of crisis then was supposed to give rise to adolescence between 13 and 18, reminiscent of ancient and medieval civilizations. This period was, in Hall's view, critical because its outcome determined success or failure in later life. Hall, in other words, invented adolescence. He saw it as a supremely critical and important period, separating the teens from all other periods of life for the first time in the history of the human race. One marvels at his brilliance. He saw what had previously been hidden to all the observers of humanity throughout all history. Puberty, once accepted as a normal stage of growth, is now viewed as an alarming and perilous transition, largely due to the theories of the pioneer psychologist G. Stanley Hall. The educators, eager to accept the psychological theory and remarkably reluctant to credit preceding periods with any wisdom, divided the school grades in the years according to Hall's hypotheses. Kindergarten and elementary took care of the pre-savage and savage periods of childhood. Junior high schools eventually and regular high schools initially segregated the dangerous teens. In this system, college became reserved for those who had successfully traversed the perils of adolescence. Now, we don't know where Hall would have placed the modern graduate school, perhaps as a prelude to heaven, which it seems to occupy in the minds of educators. We do, however, have the advantage over Professor Hall and John Dewey and their colleagues because we know what happens after that. Results, of course, didn't appear overnight. By the late 20s, people became aware that children were operating within peer groups. Now, the term peer once meant nobleman. In time, it deteriorated to mean persons of equal rank. And finally, in the United States, it became a term for children of the same age. G. Stanley Hall when he became aware of this new phenomenon, began to talk about the peer orientation of adolescence. Now this was, of course, a tautology. To force people to study and associate together by age and then point out that they were doing so seems less of an explanation than one would expect from a first-class mind. What happened was that children had been set aside from adult society to live in worlds and fashions of their own, or those forced upon them. The impact upon society is notorious and hardly needs my description. Every parent knows that sending a child into a world where authority figures dominate, new rules are laid down, and new exceptions to normal behavior or parental guidelines exist, is to physically lose control and often even understanding of one's own child. A contrast with previous periods can hardly be made because European boarding schools, for instance, in England and elsewhere, were almost all religious. The parent knew the values being inculcated and shared them. The value of the new American schools, however, in the latter part of the last century and extending into today, are those of psychologists and educators who proudly trace their ideas to G. Stanley Hall, John Dewey, Darwin, Freud, and similar a-religious sources. Nor are these boarding schools. They are day schools from which the student returns every evening. The family circle, therefore, becomes a second arena for the child, where the rules are distinctly different than they are in the school. In former centuries, when families were extended, there was a wide variation in the ages of its members. Before abortion became fashionable, women had many children. The ages between the youngest and the oldest could range as long as 20 years. Family members became accustomed to this variation, to having brothers and sisters of all ages and sizes, all part of the family circle. But in our smaller nuclear families, the disparity between the parents and the children is far more visible and alienating. The child becomes attached to its peer group, and we're all familiar with this. We're all familiar with the fact that children, as a rule, do not speak to us when we are adults, and look at us strangely if we attempt to speak to them. They almost can be said to live in a different world. Generational differences, which was formerly unknown, became increasingly obvious. Early in the century, men began to believe that they were regarded as simple money-making machines by their families. And young people, experiencing a similar chill, began to look for emotional support from one another. An increasing number of women found family life insufficient. The family became a way station for different and not particularly friendly peer groups. Once the children are grown, they leave as soon as possible, and the parents retire, end quote, from family as well as from outside work, and take refuge in leisure world or its equivalent among their age group. And all this appeared in stages. By the 20s, adolescents could quite successfully insulate themselves from the worlds of both children and adults. They began to associate outside school only with each other, to stay out late, to have lives apart from their families. And this pattern extended into college, into sports, into selected entertainment, even into language and modes of self-expression. And that's the bright side. The dark side, with street gangs, intergenerational antipathy, dance halls, and bootleg gin in the 20s. Not that gangs were especially a new phenomenon, but in former years they were composed of men and boys of all ages, much as in the third world countries today. Now, In the last decade of the 20th century, the gangs consist of racial peer groups addicted to using, buying, and selling drugs and steeped in murderous crime. This social segregation, initiated in the schools and spread to all society, now separates virtually every group from every other. The Grey Panthers and the AARP are active in politics. Women are divided from each other according to age as well as class. I was told by the president of the Republican Women's Clubs of the state of California that their membership is aging and that younger women are too busy with their careers and family to take part in Republican women's politics. And we also have feminists, pro and con, abortionist women, and so forth. Americans today automatically turn to a group as a means of organizing expression or activity. If no group exists, a group is formed. Individual expression is regarded as useless and eccentric, somewhat dim-witted, naive. An entire society, once homogeneous in terms of tradition, has been splintered and segregated into groups according to age, in childhood, shared school associations in early adulthood, professional and/or union affiliation later, and finally complete group separation by income, residential pattern, race, ethnicity, and religion later. The generation of my father and Franklin Roosevelt, for instance, were remarkable for their excellent manners and their wide acquaintance up and down the social ladder. It's not possible for even the most friendly of persons to achieve such a wide variety of personal acquaintances today, because members of other races and age groups look at outsiders beyond their own enclaves with suspicion and with arguments they've learned in school that foster resentment and dislike. And this is true not only of both sexes and all age groups, but of inverts from both sexes, who now censor books, periodicals, broadcasts, films, libraries, school texts, all the areas of public expression. We are haunted by racial, ethnic, and gender taboos that have virtually destroyed artistic and intellectual freedom in the name of tolerance and harmony. Everyone in this country today feels these pressures. Women live in the same constricted and narrow emotional world as their husbands and children. Mother-daughter conflicts are common, as are father-son collisions, for much the same reason. Girls are as separated from their families by public education as are boys. Sororities mimic fraternities. Feminism has evolved not out of the desire of young women to take part in politics as did the suffragettes, but for much the same reasons as men rebel. They both want to live like men. An education that denies differences in the genders in all but the physically sexual area has led to wide-scale protests by women against having children. And this is a stage that not even the Spartans reached, and one that underscores the power of propaganda. A society that can persuade millions of women to be voluntarily barren is something new and unprecedented and headed toward death. Our government today views us as a statistical society where probabilities outweigh individuals based upon mathematical theory, the basis for polls. Politicians, merchants, advertisers, social scientists, even criminals, classify us into so many members of so many herds, identifiable by postal zones, race, income, age. And this new numerical society in which the family can be penetrated by any of the forces of government at any time is actually governed not by consent, but by our professional classes. Our professional class has created the reigning orthodoxies of education along the pattern of G. Stanley Hall and John Dewey. Other specialists instruct corporate managers on how to structure and manage the people in their firms. Human resources experts evaluate, grade, and recommend promotions according to age and stage in an adult version inside the corporation of an insulated school existence. One can still see the age and ethnic, racial, and gender mixes on the factory floor, but a stroll through headquarters, going up floor by floor, you will see the grades of the managers rising with their age until they reach the perilous mid-50s at the top, where forced retirement begins to loom. Every stage of maturity is now ranked and evaluated, analyzed, in the same way that children were first tested and graded. Every decade of chronological age is held to contain its special periods and perils. The elderly no longer command the respect of tradition. Old people are increasingly seen as burdens upon society, persons whose usefulness is at an end. And where abortion reigns, euthanasia appears equally logical, equally drained of love. This is a logical development from the treatment of individuals as numbers, the family as a construct, and time as an immediate battery-operated watch or computer. People first became linked to the machine and then became part of the machine. This is a stage of civilization that has long been envisioned by intellectuals throughout the centuries. In his New Atlantis, published in 1627, Sir Francis Bacon predicted that the society of the future would be ruled by persons who passed examinations given by experts, that clocks would be self-winding, that vehicles and even music would be transported through the air, that ships would move beneath the waves, and that all would be well in the world. A century earlier, Sir Thomas More wrote his famous Utopia, a word that means nowhere, about an imaginary island where all the homes were exactly the same size, situated exactly the same distance from one another, inhabited by families of exactly the same size. If one family member died, they would put in another one to keep the number the same. In More's Utopia, there was no capital punishment. Everyone, male and female, had to work outside the home. There was no nobility. All the cities had precisely the same number of people, and food was eaten for nutritional value and not for taste. I hope our government doesn't read that. 2,000 years earlier, Plato, whose imaginary republic is still influential, preceded modern psychologists and educators, social scientists and therapists in his dream for the future. He was the first to advocate the end of all gender distinctions in the world of work, saying that both sexes have the same talents and therefore should be free to enter into all occupations equally. Not producing, he added, more than enough offspring for fear of getting into need or war. End quote. Plato believed that both literature and speech should be censored, lest they mislead the young or offend the mature. Andy Rooney knows what he was talking about. That God should be credited with all that was good, but disassociated from all that was not. After all, he said, God is responsible for only a small part of the events of man's existence. The greater part does not come from him. End quote. In all these dreams of perfection on earth, ranging beyond Sir Francis Bacon and Sir Thomas More and Plato, and including Karl Marx and G. Stanley Hall, and an army of liberal socialist scientists, as they like to be known, we see the same power hunger on the part of persons anxious to organize everyone else, to tell everyone else what to think and what to say and what to do and how to live and even who to live with. This hunger for personal power and authority has resulted in rule by Western mandarins, professional groups with authority denied the average citizen. This has injured the life and soul of the nation. Not simply the social scientists, but the lawyers on the bench, and the physician in the clinic, and the architect in the city, and the impresario in the various forms of the modern theater have all decided that they have a right to act as Plato's guardians over the people. We are not provided with what we want, with what is determined, but with what is determined to be good for us. The media tells us only what it decides we should know, not everything that occurs. When I asked him why he printed only a small part of the details of an interesting event, one editor said to me, "I don't want to stir up the animals." Along the same lines, physicians no longer feel compelled to tell patients when their disease is terminal. Educators forbid children to take some textbooks home. Polls keep private records of the people they interview while pretending not to. And all sorts of official professional deceptions are conducted by both governmental and private groups. Of course, there's always been a private sector. At one time, the physician, the lawyer, the accountant, and the family could keep information from the public. Public means governmental. People had rights. The government was limited. Today, the government insists upon knowing all, and all professionals seem to have access to the information so gathered. This is no longer a society that determines policy on the basis of people's opinions, but on the basis of professional assumptions privately formulated. And we see the results in terms of the family on all sides. You've heard about some of them from Dr. Carlson. I won't try to repeat what he has described. Let it suffice to say that the professions that brought us freedom for pornography and censorship for open social discussion are the same professions that are in positions of authority over the family. Unfortunately, our professionals as such present an unprecedented societal problem. We have the term quack for those who pretend to have qualifications which they do not. But we have no term for people who have professional qualifications who are completely incompetent. When the longest schooled, you notice I do not say best educated, when the longest schooled professions of our society destroy tradition and create a series of segregated groups in the name of tolerance and progress, it is time to opt out. The author of a book on aging, which I cited several times in this talk, made the observation simply in passing, quote, "The government has supplanted the family and other associations that traditionally held an intermediate position between the individual and the state," end quote. That was an intermediate position once held by the aristocracy. The purpose of the original aristocracy was to protect the people from the despot. Well, of course, we created a society without an aristocracy, and we put in the place of an aristocracy the professions. But they're not protecting us from the despots. They have replaced the despots. And imagine that the author of a book on aging, whose family was not his subject, says the government has supplanted the family. A Princeton professor. How old are you is the title of the book. And it throws an indirect light on the situation of the family, and much better, in my opinion, than many a direct volume. We have been manipulated by a professional cadre that has used the advantages of position and authority in the universities to change the United States from the country we inherited to something new and strange and even sinister. And what can we do about it? When the intellectual superstructure of the nation has created immeasurable damage, has misled several generations, and has landed us in a societal swamp, what can we do to extricate ourselves and our children? I'm sorry to say that beyond helping organizations like the Rockford Institute and the Chalcedon Foundation and others, both of which seek from their separate positions to try to provide helpful information, your most important effort is going to have to be individual. Many of you are homeschoolers, and I applaud that. Many others of you believe that whether you like the schools or not, you have to send your children to them so that they can be accepted in American society and have proper entry into the workforce. I don't agree. One cannot overcome a bad system by joining it. I think it's time that we looked at our Christian heritage not as part of the dead past, but as a record of how to overcome anti-Christian tyranny. For that is what we today confront. And although there are obvious differences, I agree with John in his brief reference to the Puritans, although I would rather say the Calvinists. The Calvinists of England in the 1600s, they weren't all Puritans. Some were simply people who believed in the Calvinist doctrine. They didn't go as far as the Puritans. They found the government of James I and Charles II to be against their beliefs, and governments that determined to change the social pattern of Cromwellian England, whether the Calvinists liked it or not. Now, the Puritans were an extreme group within this larger group. They decided to opt out in a very spectacular way. They refused to take part in fashionable imbecilities, and they made their refusal obvious. When starch collars were popular, they wore lace collars. When all colors except black were fashionable, they wore black. When everyone went to the often filthy theater, they stayed away. When people laughed at them, they couldn't care less. Now, all the Calvinists didn't go that far, but they were all firm in their disdain of practices and people who were clearly headed for destruction. Nothing could convince them that the men and women who created Cromwell's England had to join in ruinous practices. And although their period of power was relatively brief, they did pick England out of the mud of the first two Stuarts and set it on the road to world empire. And later, when Charles II and his successors placed obstacles in their path, barred the gates of Oxford and Cambridge to their children, they went to the New World. And then they proceeded from the New World to break the ties with England and to bring the Industrial Revolution into motion here, to lift the living standards of the world and take this whole great continent out of English hands. Now, that impulse declined in religious terms in later generations. The faith declined. The country, spiritually speaking, has declined with it. Not all at once, little by little. Every decade seemed to bring the transcendental closer to the earth. Every decade lowered the sky and narrowed the vision to the here and now. Every decade pounded chronological age and condition into every heart. Every child had to stay in school longer after maturity in order to be able to earn a living. Birthdays became like the tolling of a bell, so that women feared the age of 30 and men 40, and all over 60. We won't even talk about that. What a narrowing of life. What a way to snuff out the joys of this beautiful world. What a burden to live with a media that inundates us with bad news every hour, week, month, and year. If any other nation's faults were detailed by our press as assiduously as our own, that nation and people would declare war on us. Meanwhile, the entire family is tied to the clock, fastened to the school schedule. School and commuting schedule, my wife added. Lectured on how to live, denied individual decision by an intricate network of sociological bureaucrats armed with authority by the courts, the government, the professionals who have become our modern clerisy. Life in the United States didn't start out this way. We didn't grow rich this way. We didn't astonish the world this way. Never in all history has the world seen a better example of what happens when its rulers and governing classes lose sight of God. It's like putting out the sun. Everyday life turns into twilight. Families in such a society can barely hold together. We should look overseas at the changes that have taken place in Central Europe. As soon as the people realized that they could raise their voices, some were shot dead in the first weeks, not only in Romania but in the other countries, in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and other parts. But when larger crowds appeared, the authorities were overwhelmed. They didn't dream of the extent of hatred and contempt they had accumulated during their years of authority. Our rulers are proud of sending accident victims to therapists for grief treatment, but they leave our streets unsafe. They tell parents they have no right to monitor their children's education while out-of-wedlock pregnancies increase. They intervene in 10,000 ways into the inner life of every family, and they have no idea of the extent of the disgust in which they are held. We see proof in Europe that governments are not insuperable fortresses. They are fragile. They rely upon docility and silence, obedience and fear. Christians in this country number in the tens of millions. We have within our hands the ability to restore family rights, to revive the rights of the faith, to discipline Congress and the courts, and to regain the country. We can regain control of our families. We can create our own responses to the mandarins of society who advise young men to burn their draft cards but not their diplomas. We are creating our own schools, setting up our own publications, mounting our own arguments, writing our own books, regaining our vision of the transcendental, controlling our own lives. The family cannot live as a governmental unit. We as a people cannot live tied only to the earth, the house, the car, the job. Time is not measured by a clock, but by the values of eternity. Our age is not the length of our lives, but the content of our lives. To struggle against principalities and powers is, as it has always been, the challenge and the source of our lives now and forever. Thank you.